Hey everyone, it's Will here from Singletrack magazine and singletrackworld.com, and today I want to chat to you about a bike that I've been testing for the past few months. Now firstly we're going to chat a little bit about what that bike is and what makes it special. Then we're going to go into some detail about the build kit that I've got set up on the test bike here. And finally, and most importantly, I'm going to tell you how it rides on the trail. Right, so the bike next to me is of course the Santa Cruz Blur. Now many of you will be familiar with the Blur name. It is a bike that's been in Santa Cruz lineup in the past. This new model though shares very little in common with those previous models. In terms of the broader Santa Cruz lineup, it slots right in between the HIGHBALL hardtail and the TALLBOY short travel trail bike. The Blur has a little less travel than the TALLBOY. We've got 100mm of travel here, courtesy of the VPP suspension design. It's rolling on 29-inch wheels, and 29-inch wheels only. You cannot fit plus tyres on this bike. And it's all built around a lightweight, high-tech carbon fibre frame, which Santa Cruz states is the lightest full suspension frame it has ever produced. Now earlier this year I travelled to California to test out the new Blur on some of the trails local to Santa Cruz headquarters. The bike that I tested was set up as a flat-out cross-country race bike, so it had 100mm travel Fox 32 step cast forks and very lightweight Maxxis Aspen race tyres. Now I got along with the bike really well. I thought it was a load of fun, I thought it was really efficient and very direct to ride. But for my intermediate riding level, I did find that the twangy fork and the fast rolling tyres were holding back the bike a little bit in the rough stuff. Now Santa Cruz do offer the Blur in several complete bike options, but they also offer it as a standalone frame set. We've got the Blur CC frame set here and we've built it up from scratch as a long-term test bike. For those of you wondering, the medium frame set I've got here came in at 2.25 kilograms, and that's including the rear shock, the rear axle, seat collar and associated hardware. So it is quite lightweight, but it's not quite as light as something like a Scott Spark RC or a Canyon Lux SLX. Still impressive though for a carbon fibre dually that is using a multi-pivot suspension design. Now although Santa Cruz has targeted the Blur at cross-country racing, the frame will actually accommodate up to a 120mm travel fork, and that's exactly what we've done here. I've plugged in a Fox 34 step cast fork which has 120mm of travel, 34mm diameter stanchions, but it's also got a very impressive weight of just 1650 grams. It's a fantastic option for this kind of new school aggressive cross-country bike, so think Yeti SB100, Intense Sniper, and the Santa Cruz Blur. Now with that longer fork on the front, the geometry does change. Everything lifts up a little bit and the angles do slacken out a bit. So the head angle kicks back to 68.1 degrees, the seat angle relaxes to 73.1 degrees, and the bottom bracket lifts up by about 12mm. Measured here statically to the floor, it measures at 340mm. To match the longer travel fork and the slacker geometry, I built up the Blur with a slightly burlier part spec too. We've got wheels from Santa Cruz. These are the Reserve Carbon 27 rims. They have a 27mm internal rim width and they're set up tubeless with BONTRAGER XR5 team issue tyres. These are listed at 2.3 inches wide, but they actually measure up a touch wider than that. They have quite an aggressive tread pattern, and I've been able to run those anywhere between 18 to 25 PSI, depending on the trail conditions. The cockpit comes from RENTHAL. We've got 760mm wide RENTHAL carbon fat bars, and that's paired to a 50mm apex stem. I've also got ERGON GE1 Evo grips here. I really like the feel of these grips, and their flared ends actually widens the effective bar width a little as well, so it gives it quite a trail bike feel on the front of the Blur. The other crucial component that I wanted to fit to this bike was a dropper post. Now Santa Cruz has built the Blur frame with a 31.6mm diameter seat tube. It's quite compact as well and there's plenty of standover clearance, and that allows a load of flexibility to fit a reasonably long dropper post. In my case, I've got a 150mm travel race face turbine R. This is structurally identical to a Fox Transfer dropper post, so as a result it works really well. It's been rock solid throughout testing, and it's got a really nice fast return speed with an audible top out clunk, so you always know when it's at full height. I am running the Raceface Turbine dropper post lever, and I must say it is much nicer to use than the Fox transfer remote. The rest of the build kit comes from SRAM. We've got an XO1 Eagle drivetrain on here and level ultimate brakes, which are absolutely superb. As it's set up here without pedals, this bike weighs in at 11.64 kilos. So pretty porky for a cross-country bike and definitely heavier than the Blur that I tested back in California. Right, so I guess you're wondering, how does this bike ride? And I will admit, initially I was somewhat skeptical because not every cross-country bike takes well to having a longer travel fork plugged in the front of it. In the case of the Blur though, this Fox 34 does wonders to this bike. It is a much stiffer fork torsionally than, say, a Fox 32, and especially compared to a Fox 32 step cast. The Blur frame is already quite stiff and stout. It's built with oversized carbon fiber tubes, and we've got alloy linkages and angular contact bearings, which minimize the amount of wiggle and flex through the back end. Speaking of, Santa Cruz has built this frame to be one-by specific, and without any need to factor in a front derailleur, they've been able to beefen up the bottom bracket area. They've also been able to put in this extra vertical upright on the drive side as well as the non-drive side. Now, aside from giving it a really nice symmetrical look, it also helps to strengthen the rear swing arm, gives it a load of stiffness all the way to the rear axle, and as a result, the Blur has a really purposeful, really precise feeling through tight single track. Even with the burlier build kit, this bike maintains its snappy demeanor, which has made the Blur such a great cross-country bike. Santa Cruz has built the Blur with just the right amount of anti-squat, so when you are mashing on the pedals, the suspension does stiffen up a little bit, lifts the whole bike up and propels you forward with fantastic acceleration. But there's not so much anti-squat as to stifle the suspension deeper into the travel. In fact, I would say that the Blur has quite an open and active feeling to its suspension. It has great traction, the rear tyre follows the terrain really well. I typically run the rear shock in full open because I think it pedals well enough as it is. But by leaving the rear shock full open, it allows a really nice active feel. The whole bike is quite comfortable to ride, especially for a 100mm travel bike that already pedals quite well. The big tubeless tyres definitely help here. I'm a big fan of these XR5s and also the low pressures you can run them at. Speaking of the rear tyre, there is plenty of clearance in the back end here. Now, Santa Cruz states you can fit up to a 2.35, maybe even a 2.4 inch wide tyre in the back of the Blur. Now, that's somewhat dependent on the width of the rim and also the tyre model because they do vary somewhat. But there is still clearance in the back end to run some proper tyres in the back of this bike. Combined with the active suspension, this bike climbs really, really well. I was a little worried at first that the slacker seat angle might put too much of my weight behind the bottom bracket, but that proved to be completely unfounded. In fact, within the first couple of rides, I actually shifted the saddle a little bit further backwards on the rails to get my knees in the right spot over the pedals. Since then, it's been really comfortable and I've had no issues with climbing whatsoever. The front end does take a little bit more weighting on the front tyre to keep it from wandering on steep climbs, but it's not as much as you'd think because the cockpit is already fairly low on this bike with that very short integrated head tube. One other thing I was worried about with the bigger fork on this bike was the tall bottom bracket height and whether that would affect cornering and handling on the trail. Now, that concern proved to be completely unfounded, mostly because the bottom bracket isn't actually that high. When I'm sitting on the bike and the suspension is at sag, the BB measures 304mm off the ground. Still, there is a little more clearance there, and I've actually found that really beneficial. I can't really recall any moment where I've smacked the pedals on a rock, and that means I've been able to ride some pretty technical, rocky, slabby climbs without fear of smashing the pedal and stalling on that climb. Particularly with wide open corners as well, I've been able to keep the power down more consistently, which for a lightweight trail bike or cross-country bike is exactly what you want. Combined with that wider handlebar, that short stem, and that torsionally stiff frame, this bike corners so well. It's really rigid, really precise, particularly when you're loading up the pedals through the turns, and I had no problems with agility on this bike whatsoever. Now, on the note of handling and front-end steering, I've actually been doing some offset testing on the front of the Blur. Now, if you're looking at a complete bike, Santa Cruz builds the Blur frame around a 44mm offset fork. With the Fox 34 step cast on the front here, I've actually got one in a 44mm offset and in a 51mm offset too, and it does change the handling. Now, I've got some more back-to-back testing to be done, and there will be a full feature coming on the offset test on the front of the Blur, so make sure you stay tuned to singletrackworld.com and our YouTube and Facebook channels for the full feature on that offset test. As you can probably tell, I've had a load of fun testing this bike with the 120mm fork and that burlier part spec. I think the Blur is such a capable and versatile bike, and you can get a whole lot more out of it by just changing a few of the components. In fact, you could get the one bike with 2 sets of forks and potentially a few pairs of tyres and change it up depending on the riding that you're doing. You could have this nice, fun, capable, pocket-sized trail bike for 90% of the time, and then with a swap to a 100mm travel fork, some faster rolling tyres, you've got a cross-country race bike. So there's a load of versatility in this chassis to be taken advantage of. Now, if you want to read the full in-depth feature on my experience with the Blur setup as it is here, then make sure you jump on singletrackworld.com to read the full review. And if you like this video, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, sign up to our Facebook page, and we'll have plenty more videos coming for you in the near future. Hope you've enjoyed watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Tooroo!